Republican Herbert Hoover served as president from 1929 to 1933. Remembered most for his time in the Oval Office at the start of the Great Depression, Hoover also served as the Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. In this hour-long 1960 NBC interview, Hoover discusses his life beyond the presidency. Speaking with reporter Ray Henley, he delves into topics including his childhood, his time in China during the Boxer Rebellion, and his involvement in supplying food to civilians in German-occupied Belgium during World War I. This program is part of the collections of the Stanford University Library's Department of Special Collections and University Archives.
This is the campus of Stanford University, one of America's great schools. This is the Memorial Church. This is the Memorial Theater. And this is the Library on War, Revolution, and Peace. The news commentator. I am meeting a great American and an old friend. I am here to have a talk with the 31st President of the United States, Mr. Herbert Hoover.
Sit down, Ray.
Thank you, sir. Could you tell us what it means?
Well, it is the Library on War, Revolution, and Peace. The purpose of it is to present the complete history of this world since the beginning of First World War. It has many objectives. One of them is to aid in the development of measures of peace out of a display of the experience of the world in that quarter. It covers economic, military, other questions. It is now the haven of historians from all over the world, because the German War Library was destroyed in the last war, the French War Library was destroyed, and the British War Library was greatly damaged. This is practically the only complete story of what has happened in the last 50 years.
How did the idea of the library start?
I was crossing the North Sea on a usual journey to Belgium in connection with relief, and I had a book with me to read written by Andrew D. White. He was the great historian of the French Revolution.
Yes.
And he complained in that book that he had not been able to present the life of the people in general of France because of the disappearance of fragmentary literature, newspapers, bulletins, 1,000 things that displayed the life of a people. I concluded that I was in a unique position to collect that material. So I established collection agencies in all of the countries at war in Europe. I was going behind the lines once a month on a circuit around in connection with my particular job. And so we started the collection of that type of literature, and ultimately we moved into more important documentation.
Well, then the library must contain a huge number of documents.
It contains today probably 20 million documents. Many of them are the originals which form the turning points in world history. The most pathetic of them, I think I would show you, and that is this. When the Russians invaded Poland, they took about 250 Polish military prisoners. They sent them into work camps all over Siberia. Later on, when the Germans attacked the Russians, anxious to increase their military strength, asked the Poles to reassemble those armies out of those work camps. They were able to find about 60,000 Poles still alive out of the 250,000 that were originally sent. But every one of these Poles coming out of a work camp had to get a permit, which was constituted as sort of a railway ticket to the headquarters where he was recruited. The Poles were a small minority in each camp, and they relate in their depositions who else was there and how many, and these tickets themselves show the location, so that one is able to reproduce the whole slave system at that particular period. And at that time, there were obviously about 14 million people in slave camps. We have here a map showing the location of these slave labor camps made up from the 40,000 documents which we have in the library.
Oh, yes.
You'll see those marked T.
You see.
We have also the first issue of the communist newspaper Pravda. And this issue announces the victory of the communist revolution. We have a sequent file of this newspaper and the other great communist newspaper in Vestia, right down till today, with the exception of 3 months. And that 3 months gap was due to a over-energetic postmaster general who considered this was subversive literature, and he stopped it coming to us, so that we had to do something about that.
Did you take measures there to relax the situation?
I certainly relaxed the postmaster general, but I don't think we've ever been able to recover the lost numbers. And here is another document that has been of profound interest to me. This is the intimate diary of the Prime Minister of Japan at the time we went to war. He made an enormous effort, strenuous effort, to effect a peace with the United States and prevent the war. And the pathos of this document is a warrant for its retention, of a man who made a real struggle to prevent World War II.
Well, there must have... excuse me, did you have something else there, Mr. Hoover?
Well, I have also some parts of the Goebbels' diary. He probably was one of the wickedest men that ever lived. And he records his various wickednesses, private and public, in this diary. Apparently, he never expected for us to have it.
Mr. Hoover, there must have been some mighty interesting stories connected with the collection of these documents.
There were a multitude of dramatic incidents. I recollect that after the communist revolution in Hungary, at which time there arose a man named Béla Kun as the dictator, the people finally rebelled, and Béla Kun fled in an airplane one of our energetic youngsters collecting material went around to the headquarters. He found there was nobody there. So he proceeded to load the whole files of that outpost of communism into a truck, and they finally wound up here in the library.
Well,
another case was the one where I made a request to President Herbert, who was the first president of Germany, of the German Republic.
after the First World War.
After the First World War, for documentation that would be apropos to this effort. And Herbert gave me the complete procès-verbal, that is the minutes of the German War Council, presided over by the Emperor, sitting once a week or oftener during the entire First World War, with all of the documentation attached to those minutes. That is the only set in the world.
Wow.
And finally, at the request of a German ambassador, I agreed that we would keep it in the vault for a number of years. It's not yet open to the public.
Why is the library located here at the Leland Stanford University, Mr. Hoover?
Well, Mr. Henley, I graduated from this university, and after that, Mrs. Hoover took a house on the campus here, and in order to have a headquarters in which she could keep her two boys in school, while I journeyed all over the earth. I also, at the same time, was a trustee of this university, so very naturally, I was anxious to build up the institution.
I know that you were born in West Branch, Iowa, and I think that generally people know that after your mother and father died, that an uncle asked you to share his home in Oregon. Could you tell us, sir, how it happened then that you got down here and attended Leland Stanford University?
Well, this uncle of mine in Oregon was a country doctor, with all of the fine attributes of the country doctors of the United States. I lived with him and his family, parts of it, for a matter of about 7 years. And during that time, I got a job as an office boy. And on one occasion, a gentleman having some business with the firm came in, and while he waited, he talked with the office boy. And he was inquiring what I wanted to do, so forth. And he said, well, you ought to take up engineering. And he was himself an engineer. So we discussed it, and he rather inspired my mind. And soon I noticed that Stanford University had announced that the institution would be opened that autumn, and that tuition would be free. Now that is more or less fitted my necessities. They announced they would hold entrance examinations in Portland, Oregon. I went to the appointed place. I took the examinations as well as I could, not ever having been at a high school, but having attended a night school where I had picked up some Latin and some mathematics. I passed the mathematics examinations with such distinction that the professor conducting the examinations sparked a good deal of interest, sent for me, inquired about my family background. He himself was a Quaker. He was a great professor of mathematics and subsequently was the president of Swarthmore College for many years. But in any event, he said to come down to the university and he'd find a tour, and he thought I could get in, and he also said he'd be glad to help me work my way through the university.
I see. So there really you have two cases, Mr. Hoover, where men, older men, showed a keen interest in a young man trying to get along.
Oh, I have a number of unforgettable obligations to men who took an interest in a youngster. They do it yet all over the United States. There were two, there are many more to follow.
Of course, that was the beginning then of your engineering career, was it not, Mr. Hoover?
Well, I presume you don't call yourself to an engineer till you get somewhere out of college, but That was where I began at Stanford University.
Yes, sir. Could you tell me, Mr. Hoover, after you got your diploma then at Leland Stanford, what was your first job?
Well, I had worked during the summer vacations during my entire time at Stanford on the United States Geological Survey. That was the spot where I earned most of the money that I had needed. And after having finished that season, not having a job, that's after I had graduated, I went into the mines at Grass Valley in California, being familiar with those mines from the previous work I'd done for the Geological Survey. I sought a job, and I thought my diploma might be of importance, and I might even get on the staff of some mine. But that diploma didn't seem to impress anybody.
I see.
And finally I got to a condition where I took a job underground in a mine, and I worked 5 months, I think, or 6, as a common miner, and it was not a bad experience.
Do I understand you to say, sir, that you took a job as a common miner?
Yeah, sure.
What kind of a mine was this in, sir?
It's a gold mine. I didn't even have the distinction of being a miner. I was started by loading trucks. A miner is a fellow around a drill, and I rose to that eminent position some 2 or 3 months later.
I see. How many hours did you work a day there, sir?
Oh, the regulation hours at that time was 10 hours a day and 6 days a week.
Do you remember what you got, how much wages you got?
Oh, we got $2 a day. I think I got 2 1/4 after I was promoted to run the drill.
Well, sir, then on your very first job, you learned how to work with your hands, didn't you?
Well, that wasn't quite the whole story. I worked with my hands when I was a boy. And what I really learned at that time was the agony of walking and going from mine to mine looking for a job.
Well, I take it then that you, during that period, you were able to lay aside a little money for future activities.
Well, I certainly laid enough money aside to get down to San Francisco and look for a better job.
Well, Mr. Hoover, then, how did you happen to get into professional engineering after those underground mining days experience?
Well, I had developed a great friend of Dr. Brenner here at Stanford. He was one of those men who always boosted youngsters along. He introduced me to the leading engineer in San Francisco, Mr. Louis Jannon. Jannon gave me a temporary appointment. He had an application for an engineer to go to Australia. And there I went on my first $10,000 job.
Well, then, subsequently to that, your work took you to countries all over the world, didn't it, Mr. Hoover?
Yes, as a partner in an international engineering firm. We managed mines in China and India and Burma and Australia and Russia. I don't know where all, including the United States and Canada. So that during the first 7 years of this century, I went around the world 7 times with my entire family.
Well, it must have been good to get home then after one of those long trips in those days.
Always a thrill to come back to America. This is the place where freedom really lived.
Did you not practice engineering in Russia during the Tsarist days?
Yes, sir. We had very large operations which we managed in Russia. One of them was at a place called Kishtim in the Urals. There we had over 100,000 men, and a very successful operation. The main interest in it was that it was a complicated chemical and metallurgical operation that subsequently the Bolsheviks, when they seized it, weren't able to manipulate because they had locked up all the brains in the staff and expelled all of our American staff. And so it shut down and it was closed, I think, for 15 years or more, and all those people put out of a job.
I see. During your experience in Russia, how did you get along with the Russian people?
We got along extremely well because At that time, the government was anxious to see the development of the natural resources of the country, and we were the first Americans to come in. We had no political implications. British and French and all the other nationalities carried with them certain political possibilities. So the Russians welcomed the Americans.
I see.
We had no difficulty getting on with the people because for that type of an operation, we tried to get the best intelligence there was. We paid wages far higher than the common wage of the country. We never had a strike or a labor difficulty.
Mr. Hoover, did you ever hear from any of those Russian workers afterward?
Some years after that, I undertook a relief of communist Russia on behalf of the American people. And I picked some of our staff who spoke Russian, our American staff, and sent them back in connection with relief. They went to Kishtim to look around. There they were met by a deputation that came to them with a petition saying, will you not get Mr. Hoover and his men to come back, that life was so much better?
I see. Do you have any souvenirs of those days, Mr. Hoover?
Yes, Mr. Henley, I have what I think is an interesting souvenir. Come along. Ray, this was presented to me by the workmen in the Kishtim mines in Russia. It's a typical Russian piece. It has one curious quality, aside from its artistic merit, which is really very good, and that is the curious plaque, which resembles bronze. It comes from the fact that they use the most impure iron in the world in order to make it. It runs 10% of sulfur. No American iron smelter would touch iron ore of more than 0.1%. But nevertheless, they've built up quite an artistic industry on the basis of that curious iron and the innate artistic quality of the Russian workmen.
What is that over there?
Those are ancient Chinese blue and white porcelains.
Shall we go over and take a look at them?
Ray, this is a very unusual display of the ancient Chinese porcelain art in blue and white, in form and in arrangement. They are the very height of Chinese concepts in artistic arrangement and in workmanship. We thought it would be appropriate that this set of 5 should be placed in the memorial room to Mrs. Hoover downstairs, and that has been done.
And she, of course, collected these items, did she not?
She collected porcelains for over 40 years. Well, let's go and sit down.
Well, you were many times in China then, weren't you, Mr. Hoover?
Yes, I went to China originally as a part of the engineering firm I've mentioned to you, as the chief engineer to the then Department of Mines. It had been created by a reform government. That job came to an end by the Boxer uprising, which threw the government out. And Mrs. Hoover and I had to spend a month under artillery and rifle fire in the town of Tientsin until the American Marines came in and rescued us. That ended that job.
Yes. Outside of your experience in the Boxer Rebellion, Mr. Hoover, how were your relations generally with the Chinese?
Oh, the Chinese are a very friendly people. I traveled over a great part of China during the 2 years prior to that and had nothing but courtesies from everybody. I, of course, was supposed to have an official position and had certain protections in the shape of a company of cavalry usually. But there's nothing to comment on it particularly. They're an infinitely friendly people. They have a sense of humor. They're highly individualistic. And of course, poverty is the total aspect of China except in a very narrow circle.
Mr. Hoover, what do you think now that the communists are in power, what will happen to the Chinese people?
Well, Ray, when the Mao Zedong and his armies drove Chiang Kai-shek out of the mainland, the first thing he did was to disarm the Chinese civil population right down to the last butcher knife. And no civil population with pitchforks can ever create a revolution to throw out machine guns. The consequence is that regime is fixed until such a time as the failure of its methods, failure of productivity, should cause the regime itself to change. And no doubt they will have fights amongst the Chinese leaders. They've already shown that. And often enough, revolutions of that kind in history have blown up by fights among the leaders. And there are some of those fights going on now.
The Russians, of course, will have influence on the Chinese. Do you think that the Russian attitude on easing world tension may have some effect on the Chinese Reds?
Well, I think that they may have to restrain them if they want to get their own objectives. We may be witnessing a phenomenon similar to that which we saw at the time that Stalin came into power. He wanted time to build up his industry and his armies, and he became the most peaceful thing that was running around the earth at that time. He joined the League of Nations, he signed the Kellogg Pact, he made the peace treaties with some 30 of his neighbors. Nothing could have been more promising for lasting peace. Well, in 1939 he violated every one of those agreements. So that one can wonder that perhaps this new regime, wanting time to consolidate, being troubled by a failure in agriculture and hunger amongst their people, would like to have an interval of peace. I have no confidence with the objectives of those people that it would be a lasting peace with goodwill towards men. But it might be endurable. We might be able to reduce the armament of the world somewhat, all of which might come out of Geneva, and that's what we must pray for.
This book here, Mr. Hoover, looks familiar. I think I recognize it as being commonly called the Agricola. Could you tell us about it, please, sir?
Ray, this book was first published just 400 years ago. It is in Latin, it was in Latin, and comprehended the whole gamut of the mining and metallurgical and chemical industries of their time. There were great difficulties in a translation from the Latin because the technical terms had been invented by the author in Latin 600 years after the language was dead. But Mrs. Hoover was an accomplished linguist. She was able to read it, and with her background of technical training and the fact that I knew something about these subjects, we were able to make a translation of it for the first time. It was purely a labor of love. It had no great practical value at that modern times, although many of the processes illustrated here are still in action. In any event, for a couple of hundred years, it was the textbook of those industries. And at one time they chained it in an iron binding to the altar in cathedrals in mining towns such as San Luis Potosí. And the priests translated it for the benefit of the miners, plus the illustrations. So that the book had at one time a great weight. But of course now it's only a matter of interest. There was nothing particularly public about the book at the time. There were 2,000 copies printed and distributed amongst engineers. Since that time it's become a rare item, and it now sells for $250, but we don't have any more of them.
You didn't get the $250.
I didn't get the $250.
Well, it must have been a tremendously difficult job to translate this.
It was a difficult job. It took 5 years, and it furnished a family interest during that entire period.
Mr. Hoover, when did your career as an engineer come to an end?
It came to an end when shortly after I took over the Belgian relief in 1914. I didn't know it at the time. We all expected the war would be over very shortly and we'd get back to work. But as the war went on and on, my clients and partners had to have some other interest. So I never went back to the profession.
Do you, who was it who asked you to get into the relief work?
That was the combined pressures of leading Belgians, the Belgian ambassador, the Belgian prime minister, and the American ambassador in London, and the American ambassador in Brussels. They all seemed to concentrate on me to undertake that job.
So that this operation carried on during the war, you certainly must have been in some exciting experiences from time to time.
Well, most of it was a pretty humdrum business. You had to transport a tremendous volume of food overseas with a fleet of 300 ships. You had to distribute it, transport it inland, ration the population, and take possession of their agricultural product and so forth. And in fact, it was the first food administration in the history of the world. The incidents that came out of it were nothing very startling. One of them I remember rather distinctly, that the service across the North Sea was maintained by the Dutch, and they frequently lost their channel steamers. But they always provided methods of escape, so nobody much was drowned. One day I went down to take the boat, and I had usually paid the bill for my food and cabin at the end of the trip. But the steward came to me and he said, "You'll have to pay cash." And I said, "How come?" Well, he said, "Last voyage the Queen Wilhelmina went down and the passengers owed me £9.10, and he said I never got the money."
Well, I'm afraid you're being unduly modest there, Mr. Hoover. It seems to me I recall a story of your having been actually under fire.
Well, I was under fire a number of times, but the only time I really got wounded was when the Germans were bombing the town of Boulogne, where I was stopping overnight. And I got up and looked out the window to see this performance. And the Germans dropped a bomb in the street right opposite the hotel, and I got showered with glass. I got cut up a lot, but I never got a Purple Heart.
Now, didn't some of the authorities fight the feeding of starving children during your Belgian relief career?
We had to transport all of our material through the British blockade, and a great division rose in the British cabinet as to the military desirability of our going on. The military side of the cabinet insisted that 10 or 12 millions or 10 million starving Belgians and Frenchmen would inconvenience the Germans a lot, and the Germans were already short of food, and that it might bring the war to a quicker end. That was their argument. I was called before the cabinet, and I found in a short time that Sir Edward Grey and Lloyd George, Mr. Asquith, who was then Prime Minister, were all on my side. So I pushed the issue even further. And ultimately, I got a subsidy of $5 million a month out of the British to carry on the work. And in the end, before we were done with 4 years of it, I was receiving 10 or 12 million a month from the British.
You may have inversely answered a question that is in my mind, Mr. Hoover, but may I ask at this point, what do you think of the policy of starvation as an instrument of warfare?
Well, it may be an instrument of warfare. It might conceivably bring the war to an earlier end. But starvation leaves a mass of human beings that are a liability to the world for all time, both themselves and their descendants.
Your work in Belgium relief, Mr. Hoover, did not end your food relief operation, did it, sir?
No, the Belgian relief continued throughout the war, and I continued to conduct it. When we came into the war, I withdrew the American staff and substituted Dutch inside of Belgium. At that time, the British and French were beginning to find food difficulties, and they began to call on me for advice. And about that time, President Wilson asked me to take over the United States Food Administration. So I became Food Administrator of the United States, continued in that until the time of the armistice in 1918. And then I was asked to go to Europe on behalf of all of the Allied governments to take over the rehabilitation of the food supply of some 350 million people in Eastern Europe.
That work ended in what year, sir?
I took it up again in Russia in 1923, so you might say I had spent about 9 years on that kind of a job.
By that time, of course, you were in the President's cabinet as Secretary of Commerce.
I was.
Then you also had some relief work put on your shoulder as Secretary of Commerce, did you not?
Well, that was the Russian problem, and we had one job in Mississippi.
Yes, sir, that's what I was referring to. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, the flood of 1927 was the greatest flood that had ever been known along the Mississippi from Cairo down. And the protections were weak, and they all gave way, and the country for 1,000 miles north and south, and from 70 to 150 miles wide went under water. So President Coolidge asked me to take over that job. We moved about 1.5 million of people out of the low ground and pulled them out of the water and put them in camps on the high ground and looked after them for 3 months and put them back in their homes again. We lost only 3 lives in that operation.
3 lives.
And the expense of it was conducted entirely by American charity. We never called on the government for a dime, except that I had the services of the Navy and the Coast Guard.
You referred briefly to Russian relief in 1923. Could you tell me more about that?
A dreadful drought struck South Russia in 1923. Maxim Gorky, on behalf of the communist government, appealed to me to undertake some American help. I organized the operation. We sent some 200 Americans into Russia. They gave them completely free movement. I raised, plus congressional appropriations, about $70 million of American money, and we unquestionably saved about 17 million Russian lives. They accredited us with that. And when we finished, they got out a very beautiful scroll addressed to me and the American people of gratitude. And you'll find it somewhere here in the library, in Russian. But when the American communists get too entirely abusive, I send out a photograph of it in translation by way of stopping them up a little.
See. Then, Mr. Hoover, as I recall, your next great work in relief was the organization of relief during the Depression. Could you tell me something about that?
Unemployment across grew with the Depression, and especially when the whole economy of Europe collapsed and brought us down. And I organized relief in the United States. At the time I left office, we had about 18 million people on relief in the United States. And Mr. Roosevelt found he had to continue the same number up until about Pearl Harbor.
Your own next operations in the field of relief then came when, sir?
Well, at the beginning of the Second World War, I was appealed to by some 8 or 9 different governments in Europe who had been occupied by the Germans to again come to their relief. We organized some relief for them, but in the course of 2 years, the military people in control of the Allied side adopted the old British doctrine, and they closed off our operations. It was not until the war was over, when the inevitable post-war famine began, that I again was called back into service. Bear in mind that every world war will create a worldwide famine. I don't need to go into the reasons for that, but it's a solemn fact. And Mr. Truman was faced with a famine in 1946, even greater than the world has ever seen before. He asked me to take a part in the management of the famine, and I did so by organizing the necessary setup in Washington. And again, I visited 38 different nations by plane, organized their food administrations, got their cooperation, and in the end we pulled through. When we started, we were convinced that at least 800 million people would die in that famine. But we found a sort of a widow's cruise of food all over the world that we hadn't expected. And in the end, we pulled them all through. There was no mass starvation anywhere that I know of.
Well, it's very clear, Mr. Hoover, that your operations in the field of relief have been literally tremendous. May I ask you this, very frankly? During all these years, did you accept any compensation in connection with your relief work?
I've never accepted compensation either for relief or for federal service, except in this sense, that I have at times taken federal salaries and expended them on matters that outside of my own needs and use. As I was led to that by an overall question of conviction of my own. And I don't say this in disparagement of men accepting salaries from the government, because most of our officials must have them to live. But it happened that I had prospered in my profession at a time when the income tax was only 1%. I was able to save a competence, and I felt that I owed to my country a debt that was unpayable, and I had no right to ask her to pay me. So that that was the practice right up until the first 30th day of June this year.
And yet, sir, I think that on occasions you possibly have been smeared to the effect that you...
Oh, yes, every public man gets smeared. And I take it that the final test as to whether smears are of any right or effectiveness is when Congress makes an investigation of a fellow. Huh? Well, I've been in federal service off and on for 40-odd years, and I haven't yet been investigated by Congress.
I see. That certainly is the answer to it, isn't it?
Maybe.
Mr. Hoover, I know that you have had a special interest in children, and I believe that you set up a special relief for children. Could you tell us about that, please, sir?
Well, that originated during the Belgian problem. There were 2 million Belgian children, and the normal ration for an adult is deficient in the type of food that will support child life. So we had set up an extra meal every day for all the children in Belgium, 2 million of them. When we came into the relief of Europe as a whole after the armistice, we expanded that service, and we carried about 12 or 14 million children. If you catch them young enough, you can feed them up so that they become normal. If it's gone too far, they are the ancestors of all of the bandits and racketeers in the world, huh?
That brings to mind, did I interrupt you, sir?
Well, when World War II came on, I, having set up these arrangements all over the world in 39 countries to meet that famine, I found that there was a tremendous impoverishment and undernourishment amongst children all over the world. A desperate situation. There were some 30 million of them, as we calculated them. So I took that matter up with the United Nations and the American administration, And they set up an organization, and I suggested the men who should operate it, and these were the men who had operated in Europe in World War II and World War I, and they're still operating it till this day. And so far as I know, they've looked after nearly 50 million children in the last 5 years.
I see. As you were speaking there of child welfare and child relief work, Mr. Hoover, my mind went back to a rather notable statement that you made on the subject. Seems, as I recall, it was back in 1930 when you were president, and I believe you had summoned a child welfare council at that time. I think it's in here in this book. I'm wondering if it wouldn't be appropriate for you to tell us about it at this time.
Well, I can read it to you if that's telling you about it.
All right, sir.
That statement has been republished in many times, and it's rather an old statement to the American people, I'm afraid. The older I grow, the more I appreciate children. We approach all the problems of childhood with affection. Theirs is the province of joy and of good humor. They are the most wholesome part of the race. They are the sweetest, for they are fresher from the hands of God. Whimsical, ingenious, mischievous, we live a life of apprehension as to what their opinion may be of us, a life of defense against their terrifying energy. We put them to bed with a sense of relief and a lingering of devotion. We envy them the freshness of adventure and the discovery of life. We mourn over the disappointments which they will meet.
Thank you, sir. I think that probably brings us up to your work with the Government Reorganization Commission. 2 presidents, I believe, called you to Washington to take up that work. Could you tell me what your reaction is from that labor?
The problems perhaps are entirely too long to go into here. But this government of ours multiplied itself from about 600,000 officials up to 2,500,000 as the result of 23 years of war and trouble. And it multiplied its budget from $3.5 billion to as high as $75 billion, with a growth of government agencies from about 300 up to some 1,600, and a fabulous waste and duplication and lack of efficiency. So that the Congress, with the approval of the President in each case, set up a commission. In both cases, I was asked to take the chairmanship. The first reorganization commission of 6 years ago secured the adoption of a great many of its recommendations, about 70% in fact. They related largely to reorganization of different agencies and setting up a new structure of the government. The Korean War and the rearmament came along and obscured whatever savings there were. The second commission examined the government from a functional and a policy point of view. And we have made recommendations which, if adopted, would enable the balancing of the budget and a very substantial reduction in taxes. The last commission required 5 years to get its proposals adopted. It may take us some years to get these, but I feel certain that they will come.
And I believe you intend to keep working at it to see what you can do to make it come true.
Well, the press seems determined on getting me retired, but I can't stop until we get these recommendations adopted.
Mr. Hoover, it seems to me that this is appropriate time for me to ask you this. In view of world conditions in our own country and abroad, what do you think with respect to the chances of private enterprise returning and the chances of our having greater individual freedom again?
Well, you mentioned abroad. There has been a total economic revolution in Germany. Germany has gone back to a free enterprise system and has become the most prosperous state in Europe. Likewise, Belgium retreated from socialism into free enterprise. It's been prosperous ever since. The last election in Britain guaranteed the retreat from socialism into free enterprise. In our own country, we haven't made as much progress as we should. The Second Reorganization Commission, however, proceeded on the thesis that this was a country where the economic and social system was based on private enterprise and individual action. Both of them naturally regulated to prevent unfair practice and to prevent a monopoly. And that the government should only intervene with the people in matters in which the people could not support and take care of themselves. Well, our department has departed a long ways from that basis, and the recommendations of the Reorganization Commission are very largely in the nature of methods of return back to the fundamental thesis on which this country was founded.
Well, you know, we've covered a vast number of subjects here today, covered a lot of ground, and I think the thing that comes out of it, possibly, is the fact that you've been a mighty hard-working man all your life. However, I do think that you're also known for your relaxation. Would you tell us, how do you get your relaxation?
Well, I go fishing whenever I get a chance. Also, I go to all baseball games and any other exercise of that kind. I have a rather yen for fishing because the ripple of a brook and the slap of the wave against the side of the boat will brainwash most anybody into a much cleaner position, huh?
Didn't you once make a very famous statement about fishing?
Well, I don't know. I said a lot about it. I explained that why presidents all went fishing. They all have, even though they never fished before. And that was because the American people have respect for privacy only on two occasions. One of them is prayer and the other is fishing. And presidents can't pray all the time. The fishing question is often a problem of getting away from here to somewhere else and getting out of an awkward spot. And it doesn't matter much how many fish you get. If you get any, you know perfectly well that all men are equal before fishes. There's no ascendancy of these evil thoughts that seem to infect our social system.
That, of course, brings me to another subject that I wanted to ask you about before we part. Your interest in Boys Club. I refer to that because I was thinking of you talking about baseball and fishing. You have a very vital interest in the Boys Club. Will you tell me what that means to you?
Well, I have been the chairman of the board of the Boys Clubs now for nearly 20 years. And I was connected with it even before that. But it appeared to me as being a completely systematic method by which elder people could be of help to youngsters outside of their normal schooling and parents and so forth. The Boys Clubs have got about 400,000 members. They're all slum boys. It's a slum movement. It is probably the best preventative youth delinquency there is in the United States. These boys are taken in and they are given certain manual trainings and they're given music and they have ample gains and they're organized into teams instead of gangs. And they have an equipment that is growing in dimensions. Today it would cost $120 million to replace the equipment we have in those institutions. And I might mention to you that the Boys Clubs, these Boys Clubs, developed 5 major league players in the last series.
Oh. And it also gives a chance for the older men to do something for the boys, just as older men have did things for you as you were growing up. Isn't that right?
A large part of it is based on voluntary help of elder people. The carpenter goes in and takes charge of the carpenter shop, and if he develops a boy that looks like a carpenter, he helps him along in life and so forth.
Yes. Mr. Hoover, while I've been sitting here, I've been wanting to ask you something about these flags. This flag is the president's flag, is that not right?
That's quite right.
Would you tell me, please, why you have it here?
It is the only gift that your president receives from the American people. He gets no pension, he gets no title, but he gets his own flag. He has a right to fly it.
He, unlike a senator who's called a senator, or a governor who's called a governor after he leaves office,
And also,
a president is...
you better mention the Kentucky colonels and all the generals. And the president is just nothing but plain Mr.
Yes, sir.
And I think it's a comfortable feeling.
Well, Mr. Hoover, I want to thank you for this session that you and I have had here together today. There's just one other thing. I wonder if you would be willing to give me something of your philosophy, something of your feeling about your fellow Americans and about your country.
Ray, that rather an extensive subject. One time I wrote a passage on the subject, and I think you've got it in that book if you'll give it to me. I don't think I could phrase it as well as I did at that time, do it extemporaneously.
Fine.
So if you'd like, I don't mind reading it to you.
I wish you would, sir.
Perhaps without immodesty, I can claim to have had some experience in what the word America means. I've lived in many lands, many kinds of American life. After my early boyhood in an Iowa village, I lived as a ward of a country doctor in Oregon. I lived among those to whom hard work was the price of existence. The opportunities of America opened to me through the public schools. They carried me to the professional training in the great American university. I began by working with my own hands for my daily bread. I have tasted the despair of fruitless search for a job. I even know the kindly encouragement of an humble boarding house keeper. I've seen America in contrast with many nations and many races. My profession took me into many foreign lands under many kinds of governments. I've worked in governments of free men, of tyrannies, of socialists, of communists, and I've met with princes and kings and despots and desperados. I've seen the squalor of Asia and the frozen class barriers of Europe. I was not a tourist. I was associated in their working lives and in their problems. I had to deal with their social systems and their governments. And outstanding everywhere to these great masses of people, there was a hallowed word, America. To them, it was the hope of their whole world. Every homecoming was for me a reaffirmation of the glory of America. Each time my soul was washed by the relief from grinding poverty of other nations, by the greater kindliness and frankness which comes from the acceptance of equality and the wide open opportunity to all who want a chance. It is more than that. It is a land of self-respect born alone who want a chance. It is more than that. It is a land of self-respect born alone of free men. I have had every honor to which any man could aspire. There is no place on this whole earth except here in America where all of the sons of man can have this chance in life that has come to me. I recount all this in order that in Quaker terms I may give my own testimony. The meaning of our word America flows from one pure source. Within the soul of America is freedom of mind and spirit in man. There alone are the open windows through which pours the sunlight of human spirit. Here alone is human dignity not a dream, but an accomplishment. Perhaps it is not perfect, but is more full of in its realization here than any other place in the world.